We all rely on farmers and ranchers, but farming is riskier than other businesses out there. Crop insurance helps farmers manage their risk. With crop insurance, farmers put skin in the game by paying premiums and shouldering deductibles. That keeps taxpayers from having to pick up the whole bill every time disaster strikes. Today, about 90% of U.S. farmland is insured, providing $100 billion in protection to more than 130 different kinds of crops. It's a testament to the program's success.
Thank you for joining us today for the Meet the Farm Hands video segment. I'm Hannah Pagel, and today we are with Autumn Price with Land O'Lakes. Autumn, thanks for joining us today.
Hannah, it's great to be here.
Well, I'm just glad we finally were able to connect. I mean, this was a year in the making for our viewers. We originally set up this meeting a full year ago, and then coronavirus hit, so here we are a year later.
We are, and we are socially distancing, which is
That's
good
right.
too, just to play it safe. Yep.
So to kick off the interview, Autumn, why don't we go back to your Georgia roots, and can you just tell me a little bit about, what it was like growing up in Georgia, and then how you made your way out here to Washington, D.C.?
Sure. So I grew up on a family farm, Hannah, in a small, what I would consider a small town at that time. Smallness, rural is relative, right? That's what I've learned over my 20 years in this business. At that time, I thought it was a small town of like 15,000 people. It's grown since then. Tifton, Georgia is where I grew up, and grew up on a small, diverse small family farm, farming operation. And never really thought about getting outside of that environment. My family, I come from a bigger family. A lot of our family is involved in agriculture. Uncles, aunts, I had grandparents involved. My mother worked at USDA virtually her whole professional career. And I did not really know that there was much opportunity, but I remember in the 80s growing up, my parents kept telling me there's not going to be a lot of opportunity for you on the farm, especially in the 80s, because times were really hard. And so I was continuing to hear you need to explore the world, and you need to explore other opportunities. And so that was in the back of my mind as I went through education into my high school and into college. And so it took me a while to get to DC. I did intern up here right out of college, spent a year up here right out of college, and then went back home, ran a campaign for, at that time, Congressman Saxby Chambliss, then became Senator Saxby Chambliss, and is now retired. But that was my first real entry into politics and policy. I got a little bit of experience with policy. But I didn't even come back to DC at that time. I went to law school and ended up practicing law in Atlanta, Georgia for 3 years. And coincidentally, at that time, my mother was in DC. And that's really, when I look back, that was the point, my inflection point. I remember sitting in my desk at our firm at the time, and just realizing that I wasn't getting the real value and the real, it just didn't mean a lot to me. And I was having conversations at that time with my mom, who was up here talking about agriculture and policy, and I saw that there was opportunity to be involved in agriculture, and it didn't necessarily mean I had to go back to the farm. And that was a good thing, because there really wasn't an opportunity for me to go back to the farm. So I decided then I wanted to get back to DC. It was nice because my mother had an apartment up here, so I had a free place to stay, because we all know one of the biggest challenges is finding, it's harder to find a place to stay than actually getting a job, at least at that time. So and that I was fortunate, because I had a job opportunity at that time and came up here, and I had a place to stay as well.
Mm-hmm. So you worked for Senator Pat Roberts on the Senate Ag Committee. So can you maybe tell a story or a time that was maybe the most challenging working on the committee?
I think it's one of the things that I would find, and not given a really specific example, but a couple of more broader examples would be understanding a different point of view. And sometimes the point of view was a partisan issue, but sometimes it was more like regional, because we know in agriculture it's not always, the differences are not always partisan. Sometimes it's based on where you are geographically. Those differences are geographical, especially in agriculture. And so spending time understanding that other point of view, and then finding common ground. It took a lot of work. It wasn't really challenging as much as it took work to do, and a commitment to really explore, understand. It may even mean going to that part of the world or that part of the country and seeing firsthand the economics, the challenges, the gaps that they were having, and then having that perspective, that new understanding, helped me then think through what good policy should be, what it should look like, and oftentimes it meant compromising, right? Finding some middle ground. So it wasn't really tension or challenging as much as just it took some work to do.
Mm-hmm. Kind of going off of that, was there a place that you traveled to that you could see firsthand maybe the challenges that they were having, and then how did you return to Washington and implement some policy changes? Or?
Yeah, on the committee I did go. We were not traveling that much during those times, because if you recall, that was when the 2014 Farm Bill, many people will remember, we made cuts. We were making cuts all the time. I think we cut over 20 USDA programs. I think we cut like $19 billion, if my memory serves me right. And guess what? We weren't traveling either as staff. It was very limited travel, and that was really when sequestration was hitting us, and so we were cutting down on travel. I did get to go to Kansas. I remember that was my first trip to Kansas, working for Senator Roberts, and by the way, who wonderful mentor and wonderful person to work for, and his legacy and what he has done for agriculture and agriculture policy. It was just phenomenal to be working under Senator Roberts, Chairman Roberts. And Kansas was eye-opening for me, because coming from South Georgia, not only was I growing up on a small family farm, but even the makeup of the operations in Georgia are not the same as the Midwest. And the first glimpse of that for me was going to Kansas. And when you see sections of land, these fields just are huge, and for me it was corn. This was in late August, and I remember Tara Smith and I were traveling together, and I was just constantly amazed at just the amount, the scope of what we were seeing as far as cornfields, and that was really my first experience to say, wow, this is different than where I grew up. And it helped me understand how to think about policy from a different lens as well, because those operations were different. Now, a lot of similarities too, but there were some differences there too that I was seeing for the first time.
So when you came to Land O'Lakes, would you say that was kind of your first exposure to the dairy industry, or had you had some? Yes. So working for Senator Roberts, my portfolio was specialty crops, organics, and rural development. I did a little bit of investigative work because I was counsel, so worked closely with OIG at USDA, and oversight, just monitoring oversight work from a programmatic standpoint. The long way of saying I knew very little about dairy. The only thing I knew was hearing others say you do not want to work in the dairy industry, only because it's hard to get alignment on policy, at least at that time. So what's the saying where it's, sometimes it's good not to know something and just jump in, and that was, I think, my case for sure. Just ignorance is bliss. Gotcha.
So that was certainly my case.
So I kind of want to take a shift in the conversation, and I do want to talk a little bit about the grain glitch. So I'm just curious, as you worked through that, do you have any like stories to share on maybe the lessons you learned?
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up. The biggest lesson I learned is that we in agriculture, and I hope I'm not saying this and meaning it the wrong way, but sometimes we think too small. And if we can start from a place of, and I try to say this and not sound too Pollyannish too, but start from a place of agreement and alignment as an industry, then we can find policy that benefits us all. The grain glitch is one of those things I don't want to like relitigate. I think what I have learned from it is that we need to be intentional about what good tax policy is for this country, for rural America. And if we can start from that place, then I am very confident we can align on policy and build a broad base of support for those of us in agriculture and in rural communities. And I see that now, but what has also helped me see that, Hannah, is we have Beth Ford, our CEO, is very big picture thinker, and she's helped us all as an enterprise, myself included, at Land O'Lakes, think about the 10,000 communities that Land O'Lakes touches, and think about the systemic problems that are, a lot of problems are in urban America. There's equal problems in rural America. Some of those problems are exactly the same. I know we talk about how, there's a disconnect, but when you start digging into the statistics and the issues, a lot of them are the same. And so it's from that lens, how do we think about those problems together? How do we solve those problems together? How do we look at each other and find all of the similarities and advocate for what's best for all of us, as opposed to looking within the industry and figure out who's going to be able to get ahead. And so I think that's where we are today as an enterprise. That's where I spend a lot of our time, is how do we think about the fact that we have fewer and fewer members of Congress that represent truly rural areas, and that those numbers are going to be continuing to decline, not go up. And so it is our job now to connect with urban lawmakers, not just rural. Ag committee is great, our friends on the agriculture committee, but we've got to find partnerships and alignment and similarities with urban lawmakers too, and build support for those of us that, like myself, who want to be in rural communities or have family in rural communities, or hopefully one day my kids are going to want to move to a rural community. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of a long-winded answer of the grain, which started with the grain glitch. Point being, what I've learned is we need to take a broader approach to solving problems.
Okay. Well, you brought up your kids, and that's going to kind of be my segue into the next question.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit more about your family. I believe it's JJ and Charlie.
Yeah. So let me start with my life partner, Kevin Price, who I actually met through work, had never been in a lot of different jobs, have never dated anyone that I worked with, even on the ag committee, never dated anybody that I worked with. And I came to Land O'Lakes 8 years ago, and one of the first people that I ran into was Kevin. And we didn't even really speak to each other then. That way, I think we just said hi in passing. But he couldn't get away from me because his office was right next to mine, like literally right next to mine. And so, he would, we would continue to do that hall conversation of hi, how are you doing, but really didn't know each other. And I think if I'm telling the story, so I can say this. I reached out to him. He's probably going to say he reached out to me, but I'm pretty sure my memory is correct. I reached out to him and said, hey, he works for American Crystal Sugar, great Moorhead, Minnesota-based cooperative and sugar beet cooperative. And I'm with Land O'Lakes, and our offices are right beside each other. We probably should kind of know each other. Like, what do you do? What do you care about? What are you advocating for? So I invited him to lunch. We went to lunch over here around the corner at Art and Soul, and just thinking I wanted to learn more about their priorities, and specifically getting tips on how to raise a pack dollars. And I remember this lunch like it was yesterday. We had a great lunch, chatted, talked a little bit about our personal lives, like where we were from, our families. Turns out he grew up on a family farm too. And at the end of the conversation, it was just a great conversation. I felt like there's something there, right? There's something more there. And at the end of the conversation, he offered to pay for the lunch. And I obliged, said, absolutely, you can do that. And he went to reach for his billfold or his wallet, and he did not have it. And so his face turned beet red. And so then I said, you know what? I actually have my purse on me. I will pay for this. And which I did. And he kindly said, thank you. And I'll pay you back. I'll get you a drink one day, or some comment like that. So, and lo and behold, a few weeks later, he did reach out again, and we met up after a going away party for Jonathan Coppice, of all people. And so I still kid Jonathan that he was part of getting me and Kevin together. And then the rest is sort of history. I mean, over the next 3 months, we dated, and we got married like 3 more months later. I think it was June of 2014. Yes, June 2014. Well, we got married.
Butter and sugar was the theme.
Butter and sugar, and then little Charlie came along that year, and Charlie is 6 years old now, and JJ is 5. And as you can imagine, it's been quite a year having 2 young ones in a pandemic environment. It's been challenging, but it's been also, if I can say this, there's been some great moments of inflection. And for me, it's helped me see that I needed to spend more time. I need to make more time for my children. And through technology, I think we've all learned that through this pandemic. We have to leverage technology. I'm very fortunate that we can do that more, and I can see my children more, which is great too. And you're probably going to ask me about hobbies, and I can tell you a little bit about that, but a lot of it starts with Charlie and JJ, a lot of it. And Tuesday, we had T-ball, our very first T-ball practice, because we signed them up last year for T-ball, and we didn't have it because of the pandemic. So they had T-ball practice on Tuesday, and it was, I'm a former athlete. I played softball in college, so I'm just so excited about channeling my college athlete softball days into Charlie and JJ, and at least I hope they like baseball as much as I liked softball. And I think this summer that's going to be my hobby. This spring and summer is spending time on the baseball field.
Looking back at your career, who would you say was maybe a mentor for you? I know you mentioned Senator Roberts, but were there any others?
Oh yeah, yes, Hannah, good question. It starts with, I mentioned softball. Starting as a young child, I idolized. I have an aunt who was a softball player and played on scholarship at Florida State University, was inducted to the Hall of Fame, won the Broderick Award, which is the equivalent to the Heisman Trophy, and for those football fans. Her name's Darby Veazey, and she was my idol. All I wanted to do was play softball all my life, and I wanted to make a career out of it. And so I was on that path all throughout my early years into high school, ended up with a scholarship, went to small private college playing Division I softball. But I realized halfway through college that, well, I don't think I'm going to be able. I learned a little late. I think I realized it earlier, but I couldn't. When you're that passionate about something, it's just hard to just give it up. And so it took me a little while to admit to myself that I needed to think about my next career and my next passion. And so, long way of saying, my aunt was really my idol in the early years. And then as I started thinking about career, my mother's career at USDA was very impactful for me. And she was my mentor. I didn't think of her. I don't think many of us think of our parents or those really close to us as mentors until like where I am now, where I'm consciously, and I think about it, and my mother was my mentor, and she was the one that I called on for career advice later in my career. As my career became a more formalized professional career, but then I know this term is used a lot. Board of directors. I have mentors that are sort of my board of directors, right? And that, like any board of directors, it changes, right? Every 4 or 5 years, depending on where you are in your career, there are different people. Many that are in this town that have been have given me really good advice, sound advice. Randy Russell comes to mind. Krista Harden's another that I've looked up to. I've asked for advice along the way. She is a great role model. I know that she is a mentor for many women in this town. And then our own CEO, Beth Ford, I have learned a lot. I don't call on her for advice as much, but I think the role modeling piece is another way to think about a mentor. Sometimes it's not as much where you're consciously picking up the phone and or talking to someone and asking for advice, as it is observing someone and how they perform, how they behave. That is also a way to mentor without communicating that you're a mentor, if that makes sense.
So before we wrap up our interview, I always like to end the segment with this question, but if you could go back to day one, starting your career, you're bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, all that, what advice would you give yourself?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. It's the advice that people have given me before, and I just didn't know what to do with it, and it's don't take yourself too seriously. And Hannah, just this morning, I think it's easier to implement that advice as you get experience. But starting out, I just think about the things I worried about that were just so small, and just in the big scheme of things didn't really matter. And I just worried too much about the little things. And took myself too seriously at times, and not allow myself to laugh and make fun of myself. The one thing we're doing right now at Land O'Lakes that I love is we have regular executive calls, and our executive teams, there's like 40 of us on the call, and our CEO Beth leads the call, and she started calling on us to talk about either tell a joke to the whole crowd, or it's one thing to be in person, I think, telling a joke. It's another thing to be on a platform where it's just harder to get people to really engage, or tell your most embarrassing moment. And it's so fun. It's just a way to lighten things up, especially in this pandemic environment that we're in. And then just to see the human nature of people. And I think that's where we all connect, right? Like, we can talk about policy, we can talk about these very complex issues, but I think it starts with that connection that we're all human, that none of us are perfect. And I wish to my younger self, I had been a little bit more relaxed and had not taken things too seriously along the way. Yeah.
Well, you opened up the door there, and I just have to ask, what is your most embarrassing moment?
Well, the one I mean, it's funny now that you asked me that, there's a few. The one that I told recently to our executive team it has to do with sports. It goes back to the days that I was in high school, and my softball coach, who was also a good mentor of mine at the time, she wanted me to make sure I was conditioning in between seasons. And so to do that, there weren't that many sports. We had limited sports opportunities at Tift County High School back then. And so the one sport in the winter season was track. And those that know me know that I cannot run at all. I'm slow, very slow. And so with track, you've got like the relay race or the 40-yard dash. Or there's what's called the 3,200 meter, the 2-miler. And so that's what Autumn had to sign up for, was the 3,200 meter, which was fine because I'm slow, except I didn't train on the day of the meet. And so we're a crowd of people. I'm lined up at this, starting line, and the gun goes off, and it scared me to death. Just that blank gun that went off, and instead of running the 3,200 meter, I ran the 40-yard dash. And so everyone else was like, what is she doing? There's a whole heap of people in a pack, just kind of trotting along, and I am way out there like Roadrunner, speeding around the track. Well, I did it the first lap. And then that was all I could do. I ended up with stomach cramps, and but my coach insisted, you got to finish it. So I ended up walking 7 more laps. So clearly I ended in last place. And not only that, it was just so embarrassing because I had 7 more laps to go. So it was a long bit of embarrassment that I was living with, and everyone's sitting there watching me, waiting on me to finish. So,
oh no.
Yeah, so the life lesson there is, and I do this every day for myself, and even my team, they remind me, I start the day wanting it to be a sprint, but I have to remind myself, and my team does this too, Autumn, it's a marathon, not a sprint. Because I have to consciously tell myself that, because if I start with sprint, I just wear myself out by the first hour of the day. And then I don't have any energy, for the rest of the day. So that's what I have to continue to tell myself. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for joining.
Thank you.